Restoring the Culture is hosted by Tanya Taylor Rubinstein, story mentor, and Camille Adair, family constellation facilitator. In this podcast, these long-term friends explore how stories serve our lives. Their inquiry meanders into the realms of science, theater, health, and consciousness, moving the individual and global narratives forward as they draw upon their relationship as the laboratory for their experiments in truth. So many of us feel isolated and alone in our deepest longings. Each one of us is necessary in rediscovering the truth of our human story and listening to what is calling us forward so that we can restore the culture together.
Welcome, everybody. Last week, Tanya surprised me with the topic, and this week I'm actually going to be surprising her with a topic, so this is not something we've discussed. And rather than beginning with a quote, I'm going to share a dream I had in early 2000, actually it was like mid-2008. So in March 2008, my documentary film, Solace, Wisdom of the Dying, premiered at the Scottish Rite Temple in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And a couple months after that, I had a dream. And in the dream, I was basically in the void. And in the void, there was a wall. And I heard a voice that in the dream, it felt like the voice of God. For lack of other languaging, that's what it felt like to me. And the voice said, "You have one question. You can ask any question as your reward for making Solace, Wisdom of the Dying, because this movie will help the world." And so my question was not a verbal question. It was almost like something, it was a reflection of something about my own being, like the state of my being. And it was sort of an inquiry about something that I already sort of knew, but I wanted confirmation. And it wasn't even a formed idea in the dream. So without using words, there's this communication between us of my request. I'm taken over the other side of the wall. And I know that I am on the other side, as in after death. I'm in a living room, and I start walking quickly across the living room, and I'm walking like I'm in a hurry, which is, it was sort of like careless, and I bump the side of the couch with my leg, and I look down and I realize that the air around me has been bruised. So I realize the answer to my nonverbal inquiry was, on the other side, that there's no gap between doing and consequence. That we see the results of our actions immediately. And that on this side of the wall, there's a delay, right? Which in a way makes me think about things like karma. It's the delay between cause and effect, and how we are learning our lessons in a much more slowed down, way that likely has to do with being embodied and being in physical form. So it was such a profound, teaching almost. And so what I'd like to talk about today is a concept that has come to me since that dream. And we talk a lot about carbon footprint. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to talk about our human footprint. Mm-hmm. And that dream reminds me of the carbon footprint we leave all around us in ways that we're not aware of, by moving quickly, by not being mindful, by not being in our center. As my friend Michael Stillwater says, when you go outside of your own medicine, you're not operating from that place. And so I think also in terms of, I've been thinking more about how do we understand this idea of our human footprint around drama, how much drama we have in our lives, around our emotional footprint, our psychic footprint. And how do we, my hope is that with the pandemic, we're going to be more conscious about our human footprint, so that it's not just about our carbon footprint, but also like, what is the ripple effect of how we walk in the world? What is our impact, and what are we leaving behind? What are we sending out into the future? So yeah, that's what I want to talk about.
Just that. Like just that.
Just.
Like just that, Camille.
Simple little thing.
Thought we were gonna. I thought you told me the other day. You're like, I'm gonna surprise you with a really light topic. We're gonna do something fun, easy, light. Like, okay, all of life and death and living and dying and the cosmos and environmental equation and our emotional psychic footprints. But like, just that. Where do you want me to start? So you, so us.
It is.
Like one of our podcasts, I totally shocked you with a question. You were like, what? I'm like, so like, what's the hardest thing in our entire friendship of 20 years? You're like, what? That's how I feel right now. I'm like, you're talking and I've got a whole napkin covered in notes and they're all erratic. And I'm like, I don't know. So do you want to focus me a little? What would you like me? What's the inquiry?
So this idea of, I mean, the dream is the dream, and it was an important dream for me. It still is.
Yeah.
But I think it's this idea of a human footprint. Mm-hmm. And if we talk about restoring the culture, a part of restoring the culture is, like, for me right now, is becoming more intimate with myself and my own life, with the environment, the natural world, and growing my awareness about my human footprint.
Definitely.
And we have narratives, right, that tell us, like, in a way, like, charge forward, be independent, I mean, there are all these messages that we're living with that I think in some ways impact our human footprint in a way that isn't supportive of us walking lightly on the planet.
Totally. It's a huge question and certainly an incredible inquiry. I'll just start with what is arising for me in this moment. I woke up this morning and there was a few things that were coming to me. The first thing that came to me was a voice kind of in my head. You and I both get these deep voices that feel like they're part of us and also beyond us in whatever way we define that. And the voice said to me first thing when I woke up, "You're out of exile." And I was like, oh, wow, I'm out of exile. I moved to Nashville this week, as you know. And 30 years ago, I was directed by an inner voice to go to Santa Fe, sight unseen, and I left New York City. And I think I've been in exile in the desert for 30 years. And I had to be, because what I had to walk out, and it totally addresses what you're talking about, what I had to walk out was my shadow, my family shadow. I had to walk into cemeteries and sit with the dead in myself. I had to, I grew up in Washington, D.C., a Republican family, pretty conservative, pretty elite, pretty privileged. As we've talked about here, went to New York City, was part of the AIDS pandemic, not directly, but my community as a theater artist died. A lot of people died. And that was the door to my awakening and where I got the directive, come to Santa Fe, go to Santa Fe. And I woke up this morning at 55 years old. I was 26 when I was sent into exile by my inner guidance in the midst of my spiritual awakening. It wasn't to go to the light like I thought. It was to go live in the darkness. and to learn from the darkness. That's what New Mexico did for me. And I have such a deep attachment to the land there because it taught me everything. It's not going into the light, it's going into the dark that I feel that exile was necessary for me to become somebody who even cares about my human footprint. Who's even
right.
I
get that.
I didn't care. I wasn't conditioned to care.
I know you weren't.
I mean, there was an inner empath in me that always cared about when we'd go to Beirut or Syria and see the children who were beggars. I was this little white privileged girl with my grandfather, who was the vice president of a university in Beirut. They had 7 servants. We would travel around with who I called my Uncle Antoon, a Lebanese man who was my grandfather's bodyguard. And we'd get out of the car, and swarms of children who had nothing would try to sell us chiclets, the gum. And I've talked about this before. And there was privilege in my heart when my grandfather explained to me they didn't have food and they were trying to sell chiclets to buy their family bread and milk. There was an awakening in me and a natural empathy, but I didn't. And then I was cracked open by my friend dying of AIDS. It opened me to like the shock of life and death and lack of privilege. And New Mexico took me into exile where I had to go low, not high. And every time I tried to go high, which was the inner sense of privilege, I would get pulled down and knocked down into the...
Knocked down, actually,
knocked
right?
down.
Yeah, that's the image I'm getting, is knocked down.
Over and over. And that was completely necessary. I had to become a human. Most of us, I don't think, are human. I think what patriarchy and white supremacy and these 5,000 years of patriarchy as women and being marginalized and in these relationships where we have to cut off aspects of ourselves with men in our culture, we are dehumanized.
We are so dehumanized. And can I just say one thing? Because this is something I've been getting a little tripped up on lately around duality. Like just when I hear, I mean, because of course there's white privilege. I'm not at all discounting that. I'm not discounting the patriarchy. But I do think that part of humanizing is maybe dropping some of our labels, right? Because I mean, all of that affected everyone in the world.
But I disagree. I disagree for me. I really do. Like, I hear where you're coming from. And I think when we call it duality, we bypass our own shame. And until we feel our shame as holding whatever privilege we hold in the world, we're dissociated from an aspect of our humanity. And while we've all suffered, that's inherent to the human experience, and our ancestors suffered.
But I do think there's a bypass that can happen even with what you're saying. For example, the patriarchy is incredibly strong among women.
Of course.
Women carry a lot of the patriarchy. So that's all I'm talking about is just, I think it's more complicated than just sort of...
Well, I think
that's all. When we humanize, we humanize something, right? Then it's like that saying, be kind to everyone. Not just be kind to the people you want to be kind to, but be kind to everyone. I mean, this is really about moving out our humanity and not. I totally agree with you about the bypass.
Well, I mean, yeah, and it's just acknowledging our human placement in the hierarchy, in the rank. Right. Because there's unconscious rank and unconscious privilege. And yes, many women have adopted the patriarchy by taking on the characteristics of patriarchy. But it becomes nuanced for me. And what I realize is in my deepest humanity, I've lost my taste for cruelty of any kind. But I also am developing my empathy because, again, I've had people in Santa Fe, people of color, say to me that Santa Fe is an unusually racist place. And I perceived it as an unusually kind place. So it was my job to listen to them rather than just go from my own experience, because we all have blind spots, right? So I'm just talking about, I wanted to do the spiritual bypass. It sort of came to me having psychic giftedness and everything, to just sort of want to go into, we're all one, and I don't see skin, and I'm not a racist.
And that's not at all what I'm saying.
Yeah.
At
And
all.
that was when I was very young. No, and I just want to say, though, it's been part of my human walk to actually feel the sting of shame of the unconscious privilege. And I don't want to get too caught up in that, but coming back to what you were talking about, I wanted to say,
speaking about the human footprint, I would have to say that I think this is a really good distinction about what could sort of increase I think shame increases our human footprint.
Me too.
I think it actually makes it, I think that, and I think guilt, in terms of the way we talk about guilt and constellation work, is you carry your own guilt, and that makes us stronger. So we use guilt in sort of a different way. People could say, oh, well, that's splitting hairs, but there's actually a very big difference between acknowledging what is
agree.
And carrying the guilt of your ancestry, of your lineage, meaning that you acknowledge exactly as you said. That's really important.
Totally. And that's like the John Bradshaw work, the difference between guilt and shame.
I'm not familiar with that.
But of like his book was the shame, something about the shame that binds us. And it's like that guilt has the opportunity to help us be more responsible, take responsibility.
It absolutely does. It's like waking up.
And shaming can become toxic, but I think
absolutely.
I think if the energy is suppressed in us as shame, it can also protect in a way where it has to be felt to be transformed. And that's what happened to me in the desert, coming out of exile now. I feel like in exile that I had to go in and I had to just walk with the dead, with the shame, with my ancestors, with my privilege, to become human. And so now I feel available to serve. Huh?
And so you had to go through that, and you feel like going through that time is in coming out of exile. How will that impact your human footprint?
Well, now I'm prepared to serve from a much more humble place.
That's what I was going to talk about, humility. I'm so glad you said that, because I believe there's a healthy kind of, I've always talked about that there's a spectrum, this humility spectrum that's, like healthy humility on one end and humiliation on the other. And there again, it's like where shame comes in. So I think, I think healthy humility is something that helps us to be human and to be right in the world, and does support our human footprint. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yes, because I feel lighter. It's a lightening.
It's a lightening, and I'm curious about the connection between humility and this understanding of us as interdependent beings.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And we are, and every life matters. It's like in every story matters. And how do we come into relationship now?
Right.
With that, as leaders, but also I see it as a circle now. To me, the circle is part of the practice of humility. Mm-hmm. And it's always been my impulse in story work to sit in a circle, not be on a podium or on a stage, but in a circle, leading by being and leading by sharing and inviting people into the circle.
It's interesting, when you talked earlier about being in the desert and sort of having that desert as sort of it is a symbol of exile in a way. And I've been in the desert almost as long as you were, right? I mean, my youngest daughter is 29, and so I moved to Taos 30 years ago. I live in Santa Fe now, but that's 3 decades. It's a long time to be at 7,000 feet and to be sort of drying out, and you can just almost hear your bones clattering sometimes, right? Like there's a quality to it. And where was I going with that?
30 years.
30 years, yeah, but there was another point. I'll just come back to it if it comes to me. But just, I I guess now where I'm going, thank you for just my brain for just flowing somewhere else.
It always does. Mine
It always
too.
does, right? So you're in Nashville after 3 decades in the desert, and I'm leaving tomorrow to go back to Oregon, my home state. So you've returned east, and I'm going west for a month, and it feels like a very purposeful time for me to be going there for some deep reflection, and I'll be close on the coast, just, a couple hours from where I was born. And there's some potency in being able to like go out and experience yourself in the world in a different way and then sort of come back home. And to me, there's a kind of integration that does deal with humility. I know what I was going to say before, which is you talked about your lack of humanity around privilege, and you had money, and it was East Coast, and it was all of that, and what it was like being a very sensitive child also in the midst of all of that. And I actually think that my way that I avoided that and made my footprint larger has to do with some of the Valkyrie energy, being the oldest child and being a caretaker, and then becoming a nurse, and all the ways in which we try to serve and trying to negotiate between how we serve, and are we going to be the wounded healer or are we going to be a wounding healer? And, I've had astrologers tell me that my Chiron, which is the wounded healer, runs right through Santa Fe. So I've been here doing this wounded healer stuff, which is, I think, my version of your going into darkness and exile for 30 years.
Yeah. And when you talked at the very beginning about your dream and the fact that you were given the information that on the other side, we go quantum. So it's immediate manifestation.
That's right.
So, but that we have the opportunity, that it's not a better than, less than. And I woke up also thinking, which I expressed to you before we got on this podcast, that I had a recognition that we've othered the dead.
That's right, Tanya.
We've othered the other side. When really it's the ultimate split. The ultimate othering is to say, we're only alive over here on this side. There's an aliveness in death. And there's a dying aspect of being alive all the time.
There's certainly a lot of dying about being alive.
Which means that it's the ultimate split to see those two as separate. And if we're here, and you and I talk all the time, right, about healing the splits in ourselves, embracing our full humanity and the divinity, to me, now it's the integration, because if I'm out of exile here, I can be more full and whole and serve in the world. But to me, New Mexico is the mother, and the darkness is the mother. It was in me the healthy mother, because I was never mothered. So the land itself and walking into the shadow became the mothering I needed to become a full human being. And now I know it's going to be always. And when I was driving out of New Mexico, I was crying the way I always do. And I just made a promise, and I said, let me go. The way maybe a young adult would say to their parent, let me go and do my own thing in another place in the world, and I will always return to you.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So thinking about returning in life and death.
Yeah, I mean, and the mother, the mother is the one that holds the death, right? I mean, the feminine holds the dark and the death and the unconscious and the underworld and all of that. So, yeah, interesting to think about being remothered in the dark, in the desert, where there's actually so much light. It's really kind of a beautiful contrast, right? And there's a lack of consciousness to that. I mean, it's almost like to be remothered, you can't track that consciously, right? It's like you're being worked on, maybe, who knows, the small self in relationship to the big self. But yeah, that's kind of it's just fascinating. But I love this idea of becoming more conscious about our human footprint. And it makes me think about things that I'd like to do differently in my life, about how I make my choices.
Totally,
You know what I mean?
yes.
Especially like I mean, not just in the outer world, but like if my body and my personhood is its own universe, how is my footprint with myself? What are my critical thoughts like? Do I beat myself up? Am I loving? Am I easy on myself? Am I hard on myself?
Totally.
Right? Do I use up too much energy? Right? I mean, you think about like the carbon footprint has a lot to do with energy management and sustainability.
Do I know how to ask for help and collaborate, even
That's
with my
right.
own needs getting met?
And the interdependence must be a part of that too, right? That like we just don't do this alone, and
Nope.
and yet no one can do it for us. So we're on a dual path. This is a dual path of individual wholeness and individuation and co-individuation. And as we've talked about before, sort of this energy of the 2 by 2 and how two people can create something that one person will never
create a third thing, create
That's
that
right.
third entity. And that's also returning from what you had turned me on to that webinar with Tom Brady, the astrologer, that was amazing. But the return to the I thou, the movement away from just the individual, that relationship to the thou, to the collective, to this pre-verbal. And I'm not talking pre-verbal individually. It was before we had written language, right? To start to codify everything with the left brain. This return. I posted something by Nina Simons of the Pioneers today that she wrote about third stage leadership. And it's all very much about in the circle and the collaborative and what's happening now.
Well, and I love, sorry, gone again. It's not, it makes me think about, all the people with dementia that I've, been involved with in my hospice days. And one of the practices that I have is like, as I'm an aging person or in the youth of my elderhood, that's another way of being gentle on myself. It's like if I forget something or now I know what I was going to say. It usually does come back, but it's just being gentle with myself and going, oh, I guess I just don't have to work that hard to hold on to something. Like my mind is just a little softer than it used to be, and allowing that to be creative. So what I was going to say is I'm glad you brought up the left hemisphere of the brain, because I actually think if we were to go full circle and wrap up our conversation today, we could say something about all of what we talked about when you brought up white privilege and people who are marginalized and sort of our rugged individualism and all of this stuff. That's all left brain hemisphere action, right? And I think part of reducing our human footprint, not just our carbon footprint, but if we use carbon footprint and we use ecology and we use, how we think about sustainability in terms of the natural world, and we apply that to the relational realm, that's all right hemisphere stuff. So it's like, what are the things that we can do to decrease our human footprint at the same time, paradoxically, becoming more human? It's to become more relational. It's to acknowledge our interdependence. It's to look at the human ecology.
Well, and it's one of the reasons Sid and I moved to Nashville, even in the midst of the pandemic, is there's community here. And one of the things I truly believe is that it's going to be really important that we move or live and deepen our root systems in our local communities. So I'm like, be happy in your local community, know where you want to be, because we're going to have to, I believe, this is one of the things coming up for me, let go of our addiction to cheap travel, getting on an airlines whenever we feel like, get in the car. So how can we go deeper and create really deep roots that are satisfying in our deep community and relationships that are satisfying, so we're not always getting on a plane, because getting in a car, because it's not sustainable, right?
It's not sustainable. The way I think about that, the way I buy my clothing.
Yes.
Where I buy my food, I try and buy food as locally, as seasonally as I can. It's the same thing about clothing. We've there's so much now that's like fossil fuel based
cheap clothing,
fibers.
cheap clothing. It exploits workers.
Yes,
All
it
of these
does.
things, they exploiting people and damaging the environment. It's all connected. So it's like, how can we go really deep locally? Because now online we can be expansive globally. Podcasts, technology, Zoom meetings. We have the whole world to be available into that way. So how do we go really deep and small and intimate? Locally is something I'm totally interested in shifting my human footprint in that way.
Me too. And I think our generation as Generation X, we're older Generation X.
Yes.
I think this is part of how we need to differentiate ourselves as going into the youth of our elderhood. I mean, I think it's really important, which makes me want to end the podcast with a shout out to the millennials, in particular to our daughters, Haley, Claire, and Chloe, who really have a certain kind of genius and brilliance within them about, I think, carrying the creative vision for how to live differently, how to live with be more sensitive to their human footprint. I think they've got that in them to do that, and that makes me feel happy.
I love that. And also a shout out to the baby boomers who came before us for breaking and cracking the culture open. They were explorers of consciousness. And it's interesting because once again, Camille, here we are as the bridge walkers. And I think that's
bridging.
Generation X, we're bridging.
We are bridges.
We're bridging.
I always have felt that Generation X, that a lot of our job is to bridge the baby boomers with the millennials, because the baby boomers are such a big generation.
Absolutely.
I mean, energetically and also numbers wise. And there's a big difference between the baby boomers and the millennials.
Absolutely.
And I do think that that's our place, is to be the bridge generation. And I think, one thing Tom Brady said about the baby boomers is, that it's, the 1960s was about shocking transformation.
Yes.
And I think we're coming back into a time where we're going to see more and more shocking transformation happen again, because some of these patterns are repeating themselves now. And how do we restore that? Because the 60s won't happen again. But how do we restore the energy so that we can, sort of harness it for as much as possible for the greater good?
Absolutely. And to take what was learned and to look at honestly what didn't work as much as what did. And to know that as bridges, it doesn't mean we're marginalized. As bridges, we're playing a really important role.
It's an important role. That's right.
Yeah.
Hallelujah.
Yeah. Great topic. Thanks for bringing, again, a little light, early morning conversation here for us.
With my soft brain, a big subject, soft brain.
I love that. Oh my gosh, I love that. And no shame in anything. No shame in our humanity, just letting ourselves be fully seen and seeing each other. It's what makes us feel intimate and close.
Exactly. I love it. So we'll end with intimacy. To be continued.
Always.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining Camille and Tanya for this episode of Restoring the Culture. If you were inspired, we would deeply appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or any other platform where you heard our podcast. For more ongoing inspiration and support, please join our no-cost global Facebook community, Restoring the Culture. You can support our podcast by making a donation here. And remember, we are each restoring the culture as we restory our own lives. See you next time.